War, ha! Good God! What is it good for? Go to the back, go to the beginning, go to the beginning. I did a freelancing thing. All right, welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Edwin Starr once sang, war, huh, yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Oh yeah, war, huh, yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Say it again, y'all. While Edwin Starr may have been big in Motown, he was obviously no economic genius, for in the pages of the New York Times this week, economist, blogger, and professor Tyler Cowen argues that the problem for our economies in the West is that there just isn't enough all-out war these days. Stacy.
Yes, Max, this was economist Tyler Cowen. He's a professor at George Mason University. Sounds an awful lot like Tony Blair as well, also in the pages of the papers here in the UK, was calling for all-out war in the Middle East. Well, the headline reads, the lack of major wars may be hurting economic growth. And his argument is that the perception and persistence and expectation of peace is actually harming economic growth because the world just hasn't had that much warfare lately, at least not by historical standards. Some of the recent headlines about Iraq or South Sudan make our world sound like a very bloody place, but today's casualties pale in light of the tens of millions of people killed in the two world wars in the first half of the 20th century. Even the Vietnam War had many more deaths than any recent war involving an affluent country. And he even gives a chart, Max, of these deaths, as you see, declining since the 50s.
Peace is deflationary, and they're trying to create inflation. So, of course, that is in the interest of those who enjoy the inflationary wealth confiscation scam to perpetrate war. This is also part of the Keynesian bag of tricks that would be put forward by people like Paul Krugman. Remember, Paul Krugman suggested that it would be great if aliens showed up and declared war on Earth as a way to increase inflation and increase deficit spending.
Yes.
So this is, war is always, unfortunately, the last refuge of an economic scoundrel who is unable to argue for free market capitalism and all of its benefits. They simply see war or the state. These are statists. They're arguing for the state. The New York Times is an organ of state propaganda. To propagandize war in this way is quite damaging to the population as a whole. But it's not surprising. On this show, we've said many times that the U.S. foreign policy is, and the U.S. dollar is backed by the Pentagon, is backed by war. The unstated truth there is that without war, the U.S. dollar would collapse, and so seigniorage accruing to the U.S. policymakers would also collapse.
Well, he also makes the error of correlation equals causation. Just because the U.S. economy was growing more back in the 50s and 60s when there were higher deaths and wars around the world, doesn't mean that that was the cause of it. And he does argue along the lines of what Paul Krugman is saying, is that it focuses the mind of the population on achieving progress, because you need to progress in order to defeat your enemies. But, I mean, if you look at the Middle East, Iraq lost 1 million people. Where is their progress? Why didn't they progress? Look, they should have had a booming GDP by now with all their deaths they had.
Well, certainly Tony Blair has benefited from war and deaths, and he totally destroyed Iraq, and he's calling for a reinvasion of Iraq. And I did a little back-of-the-envelope calculation. I figured that for every dead UK soldier in Iraq, it'll add about 25,000 pounds to Tony Blair's retirement fund. So families of U.S. soldiers out there, don't think you're dying for nothing.
He also says along these lines, it may seem repugnant to find a positive side to war in this regard, but a look at American history suggests we cannot dismiss the idea so easily. Again, even though it's repugnant, look what happened. We had nuclear power, the computer, the modern aircraft, the internet. But that's the argument many make about Hitler. Well, he built these great autobahns.
Right, exactly. The technological progress that is associated with wars have a residual impact in peacetime. Certainly the man landing on the moon is the result of the computer era technology coming out of World War II, and you had this big boom in technology. But I don't think it's really a correct argument to make that the state declaring war on another state is going to enhance economic activity in a way that benefits the majority of those in the economy. Remember, this only benefits a very small percentage of warmongers and kleptocrats at the top, and you see that enormous spread between the top and the bottom. The United Kingdom now is the most unequal society of the G20 nations in the world. And in their history, the UK has never had a higher concentration of wealth at the top versus the bottom, even during the ravages of the medieval monarch time with slaves, serfs and lords, because the lords didn't have that much money at the end of the day. They may have had a few billion or 100 billion, but we're talking about people now with 50, 60, 70 billion dollars, access to trillions of dollars in credit.
Henry VIII did have quite a lot compared to everybody else in the UK, and just ransacked churches and stuff and took whatever he wanted. But going back to ways that we can boost the GDP. So here they're looking around. None of the thousands and trillions of dollars thrown at the bankers has improved our GDP. So I want to look at another opportunity for boosting our GDP, and that's to look at Walmart, because as Walmart goes, so goes America. Former managers allege pervasive inventory fraud at Walmart. How deep does the rock go? Apparently, there's a lot of what they call shrinkage happening at Walmart stores. It happens at shops across America, but the shrinkage is a fancy word for theft. Okay, so it's employee theft and customer theft. And they focus on one shop, for example, in North Carolina, just one store, and it has over $2 million a year in shrinkage. So most of the managers interviewed for this Nation piece say that irregular accounting practices concealed shrinkage losses and were an effort tolerated, even promoted by their superiors to inflate the stated profitability of stores. Several, however, offered a different interpretation of events. One former assistant manager spoke of the irregular accounting that resulted simply from low staffing levels, causing overstretched employees to fabricate inventory numbers because they didn't have time to perform a proper count of physical merchandise. So here you have the two problems of America. First of all, accounting fraud. And second of all, nobody knows what's actually there at all. Either there's a lot being stolen, or there's not much being stolen, and it's just employees who can't be bothered to get up for $7 an hour and go report what actual inventory is there.
Well, it brings up a couple of shrinkage linking problems. Okay, you have the shrinkage of the American stock market due to buybacks by corporations using the free money that they're getting from the Fed. So that's shrinking the stock in the trading on the exchanges, which artificially boosts earnings, which then makes options worth more, and the executives are carving out those huge bonuses based on that accounting fraud. Then you have the shrinkage associated with consumer package companies selling products in smaller and smaller packages. Yeah. The Coke can is smaller, the Johnson & Johnson Q-tip bag is smaller, the ready meal is smaller, but the price is the same. So that's shrinking. And then you have this shrinking, what the people are stealing from places like Walmart. And the idea that Walmart doesn't know how much is being stolen is false. That's a complete false statement, because everything is RFID tagged and very carefully calculated as part of this just-in-time supply chain management system that they've spent decades perfecting. The reason they don't report the exact number of stolen properties is because they would like to claim on their insurance numbers that are also false. So they're committing insurance fraud as well as securities fraud. And innumerable other frauds. Walmart is one of the most fraudulent companies in the world.
And as America goes, so goes Walmart. As Walmart goes, so goes America. So we have had so much money stolen from the American people, so much wealth stolen from the American people, their pensions, their savings, their jobs, all of that stolen from American people. So maybe they could add those numbers back into the GDP of like Joe Bag of Donuts there, you could have been earning this had we not stolen your jobs and your pension and your wealth. Yeah, you could be earning this, but we stole this much. So maybe they could add that to GDP. And regarding this Walmart story, the Nation asks, among the big questions raised by these allegations is whether irregular inventory accounting practices are widespread and systemic throughout the company or the result of a few local rogue operations. And if the practices are widespread and not corrected for on the company's financial statements, are they significant enough to inflate the company's profitability and in the process, its stock price?
Right now, they're all the big box retailers are guilty of similar fraud, whether it's Target, Wal-Mart, Best Buy, all across the board. Of course, they're all being pressured by online retailers like Amazon. So these big box retailers like Wal-Mart are coming up with ways to make their stock price look good in the face of real competition, real price discovery, real transparency with online retailers like Amazon and others. So they're resorting to a more pernicious form of criminal behavior than they have been perpetrating up until this moment.
I think just like the European countries have started including drugs and prostitution, I think maybe America should start including fraud because they are the chief fraudsters of the world, and that would be good. It would be probably bigger than any GDP growth. In fact, it probably kills more people than any hot war has done. Here we have financial war.
I'm sure if Goldman Sachs took something called fraud public on the New York Stock Exchange, FRAUD, took it public on the exchange, that it would achieve a multi-$100 billion market cap and be the biggest market cap security by far. I mean, this is what happened in the 1920s. JP Morgan at that time took these blind pools public on the exchange that were just basically fraud, taken public. They took fraud public. Yeah. It led to this huge run-up in the stock market in the 20s, then the crash, then, of course, the Big Depression. Similarly, in the markets around the world today, we have fraud being taken public on unprecedented scale, which will be followed by an enormous crash in the stock market and the bond market. And we're just counting down to when that happens. The markets are on suicide watch.
And finally, a quick one here from Greenpeace. Speaking of shrinkage, apparently an employee lost 3.8 million euros on a gamble in the Forex markets. I tweeted, Greenpeace employee gambles in Forex markets, loses 3.8 million euros in donations. Andrew Davies, who is a Greenpeace employee, responded, staff member was trying to protect Greenpeace from currency risk, not gamble. Obviously did not go well.
No, I mean, I've made this argument to Greenpeace, to Gerhard Leopold, who was the executive director of Greenpeace before the current executive director, and I explained to them that they had 100 million euros in the bank at a couple of different banks, and the banks were using that money to finance the companies that they themselves were protesting against. So Greenpeace, by keeping that money in these banks, was actually causing more damage than if they just folded and went away and nobody ever heard from them ever again. They're actually feeding the problems that they say that they're working against by keeping this money in these banks. And now to have somebody engaged in Forex scandal, a Forex fraud like this.
A highly rigged market, by the way.
Totally highly rigged. Let me explain something to Greenpeace. The financial market is the environment you need to clean up first. And then you go clean up the other markets. You can't do it the other way around, otherwise just blow yourself up because you're worthless. All right, Stacey, we got to go. Thanks.
Thanks, Max.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more.
Some people say that when it happens, at some point in time, not a very nice one, it's like a curtain falls down.
At some point, I could no longer stand it. I decided to kill myself.
Even I was scared of what I'd done. I punched her, but I didn't understand where I hit her.
When a man raises his hand, the woman should run. Run from him.
I ask everyone who sees this video to also speak to the children's father.
My husband became uncontrollable. He felt that he could do anything.
Why are you crying? Don't cry.
I know, I'm tired of crying too.
Don't cry then.
Right from the scene. First-rate news and eye-gripping pictures. On our reporters' Twitter and Instagram. To be in the know, follow us online.
business news, reviews, economic ups and downs from the finance hub of Moscow to London, New York, Shanghai and the rest of the globe. Join me, Katie Philbeam, every week on RT.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Nomi Prins, author of All the President's Bankers. Nomi is a former banker who worked at such prestigious names as Chase, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and Goldman Sachs of Gold. Nomi, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here in London. This is awesome.
Well, you know, you are a top high-level banker, or have been, so first I got to ask you, how can I do a leveraged buyout of Scotland? You know, they're seeking independence, and I've got a castle there, and the economy is ripe for a takeover. Like Greece was taken over by really the Wall Street, and they destroyed it. I want to take over Scotland and turn it into something big. What do you suggest?
Yeah, actually, you do got to get the same Wall Street banks, give you a little extra money at 0%, which they're only lending out to people who want to do things like buy out countries or private equity firms, hedge funds that want to buy out countries, because they're not actually giving it to little people. So you just have to, like, you know, decide you want to buy out a country as you have. Go to JP Morgan Chase, and you'll get very, very cheap money, which normal citizens have no chance getting.
Right, I call it the interest rate apartheid wall. If you're big and you want to do something like buy a country like Greece or Scotland, your cost of funds is near zero.
Yeah.
But if you're a guy who's struggling to make ends meet, you go to Wonga and you pay 5,000%.
Yeah. Or you just even if you're like someone in between and you're paid 25% on just a credit card to buy anything small that you need to get by your day. It's very interesting because we've been in this period of no cost money now for about 6 years. Supposedly it was an emergency measure to get out of the crisis of 2008, and here we are 6 years later. The emergency measure is still in place, but no one in power considers there to be an emergency, considers this to be abnormal or something that should need to be addressed.
Now, in your book, All the President's Bankers, you really go into the history of all this, and the names keep popping up again and again. J.P. Morgan obviously is a name was big in history a few times. Now, since your book was published, Tim Geithner, former Treasury Secretary, has published his book explaining his actions while at the New York Fed and Treasury. Did his arguments convince you? He says he's blameless and banks needed to be rescued, whatever the cost.
Yeah, he also says he's not friends with them, which was kind of interesting considering he is, and he was, and at the head of the New York Fed that he was before the crisis happened. He was friends with the group people at Citigroup, with Robert Rubin, who he had been working for under the Clinton administration before he became the head of the New York Fed, while Robert Rubin was a vice chairman at Citigroup, trying to solve the Citigroup problem before everyone knew about it back in 2007. So his book's interesting because he indicates he had no knowledge of anything that could possibly have been happening, and that somehow he was this hero because at the darkest hour, he and sort of all the other, people who were in the elite forces who were able to get together and buy and trade and get cheap money and sort out assets, which is still going on today, he was someone who had to do what he had to do. So he positions himself as sort of this like superhero who had no choice. And we, the little people, including apparently you and I and anyone else who noticed this going through along the way, don't have the understanding, the comprehension to know how difficult it is in that particular position to make a decision, and he did the best he had to do, and he wouldn't do anything different. But the result, of course, is that we have the zero cost money for all of these big institutional players. The biggest banks have only become bigger. The Federal Reserve continues to buy assets. It's now, last check I had from their last report from last week, has them like $4.3 trillion of debt on their books, with $1.65 trillion of mortgage securities, after supposedly Tim Geithner and his crew came in and saved the day. So it's still going on, and he still seems to have not only no remorse, no culpability, no responsibility for the danger that has been infused into the market since those decisions, but he doesn't seem to think he could have done anything differently.
Well, the theory at the time was to jumpstart the economy by buying all these assets and by interceding in the markets and make it till you fake it, or fake it till you make it, as the old Wall Street saying, that there would be an escape velocity achieved, that the economy would start to grow by itself, but it never happened.
No, the lie that's perpetuated, and this is in the U.S., this is in the U.K., this is not quite in Europe yet because it can't even get to pretending yet. But it's been said GDP is a little bit up. The stock market has certainly completely gone up past where it had been in 2007 before. It dumped in the beginning of 2009 after this crew got together and saved the markets at the end of 2008. Little people, the wages, median salaries, median incomes of normal people have stagnated or gone down relative to the inflation of actual prices of things, of food, of healthcare, of education, of rents, and even the cost of mortgages.
Let me jump in, because the debt to equity in the world in 2007 was 406% debt to equity for the global GDP. Now it's at 435% debt. So in other words, they just put all this stuff on a credit card, assuming that interest rates would always be zero and that they wouldn't have to pay off the credit card. Is that a rational expectation?
Well, it's rational for them because they're able to make these rates zero. And the fact that we've had rates at zero for so long everywhere, I mean, it's 0.5% in the UK, it's zero, it's negative in Europe, it's 0% in the US. The fact that it's been this long at this low, and there continue to be asset buying programs for all of these banks to continue to have political steps come in to save all of the crap that they've created and all the bad bets they made and all the toxicness they've put into the rest of the markets. The fact that it's still going on is an indication of how bad it really is and how much worse it has really gotten. So the expectation at the political level is, oh, this is all fine. Look, everything's fixed. GDP is, yeah, debt's a little bit higher, but we had to do it in order to fix these emergencies that we saw in 2008. But the reality is nothing has been fixed. The debt is higher. The average economies are lower, and only the markets and the availability of cash to the larger players has increased, as have their profits, as have their bonuses bounced back.
You know, I'm thinking of Tim Geithner in this context. He reminds me a little bit of Tony Blair, because Tony Blair, you know, he at the time of the Iraq invasion, he believed he was on a religious crusade, that he was fighting evil. Now, here we are in 2014, Iraq's imploding again. There's another war on the... And people are beginning to seriously think about Tony Blair going to The Hague and facing the reality of the war crimes that he committed, and that he should probably end up the same way as Saddam Hussein, hung from the highest yardarm. That would be an appropriate end to his inglorious career. Tim Geithner, I think in 5 years' time, similarly, they'll recognize that this guy, for all the blather, that he was one of the architects of the biggest financial scam and wealth confiscation in history. And I'd like to see financial crimes rise to the level of war crimes and go to The Hague. Is that enough? We tried to bring Lloyd Blankfein to The Hague a few years ago under war crimes. We got a lawyer involved, and we didn't push it forward. But shouldn't financial crimes and financial terrorism, as conducted by Tim Geithner or Lloyd Blankfein or Jamie Dimon, shouldn't that be a hanging offense?
Yeah, the only difference between these people and sort of real war criminals is that they're bleeding the economy, they're bleeding individuals, they're taking things away from people on a regular basis with political support. A war, of course, generally has political support, and historically, financiers and war criminals have been joined at the hip, and this is nothing new. You can't have a war without being able to finance a war, and historically that financing came from private sources like the J.P. Morgan Bank. The Morgan Bank has been at the source of funding many wars, including both world wars and all sorts of things in between. That's why banks and politicians are so tied at the hip, because governments require private financing. And by cheapening, which is what has happened since 2008, the cost of money that private banks can use in order to leverage their input into wars, into the articles of war, and into financial terrorisms throughout the world continues to increase. So Tim Geithner, 5 years from now, when all of this has imploded again, and it's not like it's not imploding as we speak, it is. Again, the fact that we have so many bailouts and so much cheap money is an indication of how decrepit the system really is and how much he and his friends, you know, Hank Paulson, Lloyd Blankfein, Jamie Dimon, all these people have gotten together and been able to use each other and use their connections through decades to enable them to get away, really to get away scot-free so far from the crimes that they've committed against. They are crimes against humanity. They're crimes against the citizenship. They're crimes against the economy. And they do require much stronger punishments than any of them have received. All that they have received, and Tim Geithner has received nothing but a great advance on his book. All that they've received are little tiny fines that go to their corporations and no even requirement to indicate any sort of culpability for what caused these crises and how they've gotten off richer and more powerful and more influential, more politically connected after them than before them.
Now, you were on Wall Street, you worked for Goldman Sachs, you worked for Lehman Brothers, you know the kind of people that work at these banks. When we equate them with financial terrorism, let's drill down a little bit, because when you talk about a fanatic, an extremist, a jihadist, there's somebody who's willing to kill themselves or others for their cause, and they use weapons of mass destruction. Here, let's say Tim Geithner, he's willing to kill himself and others for market fundamentalism, his cause, and he uses weapons of mass financial destruction, as Warren Buffett calls them. So aren't these terrorists, the ISIS people that the people are fighting now in Iraq, aren't they cut from the same cloth as Tim Geithner, psychologically speaking? They're the same terrorist mentality. They believe in a misreading of their text, and not in the Quran in Tim Geithner's case, but Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He will pick selectively from that and justify mass murder and slaughter. Aren't they cut from the same cloth, these two?
There's a sociopathic line that goes through individuals who kill others and individuals who slaughter their finances. You know, there's a requirement to disconnect yourself from general populations, general humanity, to consider yourself better than, whether it's because of your ideology or just because you believe you're a superior person. And a lot of these individuals really do believe that. When you read Tim Geithner's words, when you read Hank Paulson's words from his memoirs after he was Treasury Secretary, sort of in the beginning of this particular financial crisis, they present themselves as sort of above other individuals.
Let me jump in here for a second, because we only have about a minute left. There's a lot of bankers on Wall Street now committing suicide. Last count, I think 12 or 20 have committed suicide in the last year or so, particularly at J.P. Morgan, because Jamie Dimon is somebody that, when you realize what he's all about and you realize you're working for him, the temptation to kill yourself is quite high. If you had stayed in banking and not jumped out when you did, would you be facing a similar crisis of conscience 10 years later, 15 years later?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I was suffering from that crisis of conscience back then, and it had been something that was growing in me back when it's not like banking was better, but it was certainly less sociopathic. It kind of accelerates as the years go by, because all of these effects and all of this subsidization that institutions, that bankers receive from governments continues to grow, and it will continue to grow absent any sort of counter fighting against it. And I really felt that when I left. I mean, I really feel like today, I am not just an individually happier person, but I just feel better about my ability to input information and just access this world the way I do, rather than how it was.
So your message to a lot of these people might be,
get out.
Get out before you kill yourself. It's not worth it.
Or hurt others. Get out, because it's not worth it on your conscience. It's not worth it on your soul.
So you were being groomed as a financial jihadi, right? You got out of the cult.
I did.
Of the Charles Manson but you and I are going to take over Scotland with a leveraged buyout.
We have to. I think Scotland needs to be.
They have to vote for independence. It's very close now.
It's coming up, yeah.
So first vote independent, Scotland, and then Nomi and I will come and run the country, do a leveraged buyout, and everyone will get
everybody
rich.
can come and share.
This sounds like a great idea. Well, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Nomi Prins, author of All the President's Bankers. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.